Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today is episode 4 of our series, How to Interpret a 12-lead ECG, where we're talking about tachycardias. Last time we spoke about the PR interval and how that can cause bradycardias like heart block, so today we're talking about tachycardias in preparation for our next episode on the QRS complex. So what is a tachycardia? Tachycardia is just any heartbeat over 100 beats per minute. It can be pathological, or it can simply be because you went for a jog or you were on the treadmill, your heartbeat sped up. So today we're doing an approach to tachycardia. And the approach to tachycardia is actually pretty simple. Number 1, is that tachycardia regular or irregular? And number 2, is the QRS complex in that tachycardia narrow or is it wide? That's it. Regular or irregular, and is the QRS complex narrow or is it wide? Pretty simple. Now what is a narrow QRS complex? Now a QRS complex that's less than 110 milliseconds is classified as narrow. So you remember from the first episode where we said each little block on an ECG is 40 milliseconds. So 110 milliseconds is almost 3 blocks. If your QRS complex is wider than 3 little blocks on an ECG, it's classified as a wide QRS complex. Now why do we need to know whether a QRS complex is narrow or if it's wide? What important information does that give us? It tells us where the impulse is being generated. A narrow QRS complex means the impulse is being generated above the ventricles, so it's called a supraventricular tachycardia. Whereas a wide complex tachycardia means that the impulse is being generated somewhere in the ventricles. It can be anywhere along that path in the ventricle, but it's a ventricular tachycardia. Narrow complex tachycardia is atrial tachycardia or supraventricular tachycardia, whereas wide complex is ventricular tachycardia. It means that you're looking at different causes for the two types. So now that we know that the two questions we have to ask are regular versus irregular and narrow versus wide, how does that help our approach? Well, the approach is simple. There are only 4 types of tachycardia: narrow complex regular tachycardia and narrow complex irregular tachycardia. And in the same way, you've got wide complex regular tachycardia and you've got wide complex irregular tachycardia. 4 types. That's it. Now, we're going to talk about each of these types in more detail, and we're going to tell you what the diagnoses are in some of these types. So we're going to start off with regular narrow complex tachycardias. So what are the tachycardias where you have a regular rhythm and a supraventricular tachycardia? And the first one, and the most obvious one, is sinus tachycardia. So sinus tachycardia is just, you've been out, you got a fright, you were running or something like that, and your heart starts beating a little bit faster, right? So as soon as that heart rate goes over 100, that's called a sinus tachycardia, because the sinoatrial node is still releasing impulses, but it's just doing it faster to meet an increased demand for oxygen. Now sinus tachycardia usually tops out around 160 beats per minute. If you see a tachycardia around 200, 210, that's very unlikely to be a sinus tachycardia. The next one I want to talk about is called atrial flutter. Now, atrial flutter means that there are impulses being created in the atria that are not being translated to QRS complexes because they're too fast. So the AV node acts sort of like a pacemaker, where it doesn't allow impulses through because there are too many impulses being generated at once. So when you get a single atrial pacemaker releasing impulses very quickly, you call that atrial flutter, right? And that's characteristic by the sawtooth pattern. So like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, you'll get a sawtooth pattern happening before your QRS, where the P waves look like little shark teeth. The next one in our regular narrow complex tachycardias is AV nodal re-entry tachycardia. What that means is, like when we spoke about heart blocks and pre-excitation syndromes, specifically when we spoke about pre-excitation syndromes, we said there was an abnormal connection between the ventricle and the atria. So the impulse is no longer coming from the SA node through to the AV node and all the way through. An impulse came from the SA node to the AV node, but then the AV node sort of kicked off an accessory pathway and things just started circulating. So that single impulse keeps circulating from the AV node to the ventricles, back to the atria and all that. The next one is called AV re-entry tachycardia, which sounds similar to AV nodal re-entry tachycardia, except that it doesn't go through the AV node. Right? It means that there's an accessory pathway somewhere connecting the ventricles and the atria. What that means is an impulse goes through the ventricle, then while it's going through the ventricle, it slips back through the atria and hits the AV node again, and goes back through the ventricles, back into the atria, hits the AV node again. So there's constant excitation of the AV node by an impulse that's getting back to the atria through the ventricles. So the SI node is kind of being overridden there by an impulse that's just coming back and looping on itself. And the last one is atrial tachycardia. That's just a tachycardia being generated somewhere in the atria. So you'll see a P wave that looks kind of strange, but what exactly that P wave looks like will be determined by where in the atria the impulse is being generated. Could be anywhere in the atria. So you're still going to get a narrow complex tachycardia, and you're still going to get a regular tachycardia, because there's only one location generating an impulse. But it can be, the morphology of the P wave can be anything, depending on where that pacemaker sits. And that's it for narrow complex regular tachycardias. Now we're going to talk about the irregular narrow complex tachycardias. And what does an irregular rhythm signify? Right? It signifies that there are multiple pacemakers, because multiple pacemakers firing off asynchronously gives you an irregular rhythm. And the most famous irregular narrow complex tachycardia is atrial fibrillation, right? AFib. Because in AFib you won't even see a P wave. There's just multiple atrial pacemakers firing off one after the other. So you don't even see a P wave, you just see a mess. And you'll see a really high heart rate. And then the second one is atrial flutter. But wait, atrial flutter came in the regular narrow complex. Why is it in irregular? Well, it's in irregular because this is a special atrial flutter. Right? It's atrial flutter with a variable block. So like I said before, you normally get atrial flutter with a 2-to-1 block or 3-to-1 block. This atrial flutter is irregular because the block itself is irregular. Maybe it blocks 2 here, then 1 on the next one, then 4, then 3, then 1. So the beats are actually irregular because the block is irregular. And the last one we talk about is called multifocal atrial tachycardia. Same as atrial tachycardia. You've got an impulse coming from somewhere in the atrium causing a tachycardia. The difference being in multifocal atrial tachycardia, there are multiple impulses being generated. So you'll see different P waves on each QRS complex. The beats will be irregular because the impulses are asynchronous. They're not being let off at the same time. And that's it for narrow complex tachycardia. That's it for the tachycardias where the impulse is generated in the atria. Now we're going to be talking about the ventricular tachycardias. We spoke about the supraventricular tachycardias, or the narrow complex tachycardias. Now we're talking about the ventricular tachycardias. Now we're starting off with the wide complex regular tachycardias. So regular ventricular tachycardias, of which the first one is ventricular tachycardia. Right? So just simple VTach. And if you see a VTach on an ECG, you know what it looks like. Right? If you see VTach on an ECG, the first thing you need to do is defibrillate. That's what VTach requires. It's a shockable rhythm in CPR. You need to defibrillate that patient. Then the next one after VTach is fusion beats. Right? Now fusion beats will look weird. Right? There's no other way to put it. They look weird. Because what happens is the VTach is releasing an impulse, the ventricle is releasing an impulse, and the SI node is releasing an impulse at exactly the same time. That impulse is hitting the ventricle at the same time, so you just get a beat that looks completely out there. I'm not even going to attempt to show you what it looks like, because it just looks unrecognizable. The third one is if you get a supraventricular tachycardia, right, with a conduction block. What that means is if you've got a supraventricular tachycardia, so it would normally be narrow complex, right, but you've got a conduction block, like a bundle branch block or something like that, then that complex shifts from being narrow to wide because of the conduction defect. But the impulse is still being generated in the atria. So if you see a bundle branch block or something like that being generated, but a P wave that looks like it's generated in the atria, then you may see a SVT with a conduction block. And the last one is a pacemaker rhythm. Right? Now a pacemaker rhythm may also give you a tachycardia, and it will probably give you a wide complex, because a pacemaker is going to release impulses at a regular interval. Right? But the pacemaker has been placed in the ventricle to get the ventricles to contract. So you're going to get a wide complex. And because it's one location that the pacemaker is exciting, you're going to get a wide complex regular tachycardia. And we've come to the last one. Right? The last one, the wide complex irregular. So multifocal wide complex, multifocal ventricular tachycardia. And the only one here is VFib, ventricular fibrillation. Right? And VFib Same thing as VTAC, medical emergency, you need to defibrillate. Right? VFib is an absolute emergency, you need to take action. And yeah, if you ask those two questions and you can answer those two questions, is it a regular or an irregular rhythm, and is it narrow or wide complex, you'll be able to figure out exactly which one of these 4 categories you need to look at. And once you know which category to look at, you'll know exactly what your diagnoses are, and you can make a judgment from there. Next time we're going to be talking about the QRS complex in more detail. Now we know about narrow versus wide, but we'll be talking about the QRS axis and things like R-wave progression and tracking those. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a comment down below telling me what other things you'd like me to cover on the channel. And if you are interested, I do offer live video tutorials on topics that you can choose. So if you're interested in that, check down in the description below for a link to the Patreon, or email me on thehelpomedic@gmail.com. Thanks everyone, see you next time.